Okay, hi everybody, nice to see you. Let's start. Welcome back. It's session number 9 of our Introduction to the Ethics of AI. And last week we started the block or the session on AI ideologies or tech ideologies in more general. And today it will be on AI and the state. That will basically be the second part of the block on ideologies, although it will be slightly different in tone and modality, I would say. But let's start with a little recap of last week. I introduced this container notion of tech ideologies to you to debate a little bit the philosophical worldviews, ethical worldviews, and then vectors of political radicalization that underlie AI research and technology and have been doing so for decades. Not in every piece of AI research, not in every piece of AI technology, but in the AI scene to some extent. And I tried to kind of cluster this in several stages. And the first stage was starting with these rather older, like coming from the middle of the 20th century, tech ideologies such as transhumanism, or more recently singularitarianism, for instance. And I tried to point out to you that in these worldviews there are connections and links to eugenics, this pseudoscience from the 19th and 20th century that was also heavily used, for instance, in the fascist regimes in Europe, such as Germany or Italy, but also in the UK and in the US. To discriminate against people, to eventually even murder people. They share their common roots with these ideologies that are still out there today, for instance, in connection to AI. I also tried to mention this trend of rationality, which is this online community, or maybe a movement that started with an online community in this millennium, and I will also tell you a little bit more about this today because that was very brief last time, and I heard from the discussion groups that you have maybe more questions on this, so I will spend some time today on elaborating that a little bit further. And then I told you that 20 or 30 years ago you can observe that these worldviews started turning into explicit normative programs, not only metaphysics or allegedly descriptive worldviews, but more normative worldviews. And among this is, for instance, effective altruism and the sub-movement of long-termism that stems from effective altruism in combination with cosmism or transhumanist visions of a super intelligence and its allegedly evolutionary role in human civilization, or its alleged risks, existential risks to humanity. And I tried to make the point to you, or I tried to alert you to the fact that among these, what I call tech ideologies, or that, for instance, Timnit Gebru and Emil Torres have been termed TESCREAL bundle of ideologies. Among these movements, we can, in the past decades, see a further radicalization into explicitly political programs, so that these movements even start kind of leaving the domain of AI, if you will, and articulating political visions. And these political visions are often anti-democratic and radical, also in terms of endorsing what they term natural hierarchies or natural selection mechanisms among humans. They would frame democracy as an obstacle to evolutionary progress of humankind. They would endorse eugenics as a political program. They are outright racist and misogynist, and they would even return to something like a monarchy. I elaborated this model of a CEO-style monarchy to you last time, where the vision is that the state could be led like a monarchy with a CEO at the head, as the head, and which is kind of modeling public affairs by how you would run a company or a startup. And this whole thing is kind of full of startup ideology. The startup is probably also what most people in these movements have seen most of their time. And so you can see this kind of exaggeration or overconfidence in this one form of organization that now spreads into a political vision. Yeah, so I had this diagram here where we could see that these AI ideologies from the 20th century started radicalizing in the last decades, and the decisive thing now is what we see, that this radicalization, this going political of the tech ideologies now combines with the alt-right movement in the US or the new right movements in Europe. So that, some people say that, for instance, dark enlightenment is the theory section of the alt-right. And there are even personal links. Yeah, for instance, Curtis Yarvin is friends with Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel kind of heavily promoted J.D. Vance to run for vice president. And this is all a connection where we can see that the tech ideologists in the form of these billionaires now meddle with politics in the form of the alt-right. Yeah, I did not get to the point last time of explaining to you why I see, also as part of my recent research that I've been conducting since last November, why I see this movement to converge or to potentially converge to a new form of fascism, or at least fascist politics. In November, I started writing this book, AI and the New Fascism. At that time, the people would tell me, better not use fascism in the title. This is such a like an insult, like using the word on something or somebody is an insult, and like it's a protest term that you would rather find on street protests, but maybe not as the title of such an otherwise important contribution. Now, like maybe since 2 months ago, the term is even in the mainstream. Yeah, you would even find it in the public broadcasting here in Germany, or in academic discourses. For instance, at the Republika conference 2 weeks ago, there were several talks on fascism, digital fascism, or new fascism in the digital age. So that there are many people now seeing the potential that this radicalization that we see here, especially in the interplay of alt-right and very mighty, very powerful tech industry, can lead to something like fascistic politics, or a new form of fascism. And only I don't want to spend much time on this here in this lecture, but I think I owe you at least one slide explaining what this would mean, at least in general, or in broad terms. And for me, fascism is a form of politics that is based on a pleasure to use violence, on a pleasure of violence. It's not only a form of politics that makes use of violence, but it's a form of politics that even finds pleasure in using violence. That violence can be physical, such as on the streets, beating people on the streets, or intimidating people with force of weapon or of physical force, but this violence can and is also symbolic, or through speech acts or defamation online, even in the online sphere. And that form of violence heavily makes use of humiliation of, for instance, politicians or journalists or otherwise individuals, public intellectuals, and so on. So it is, and the thing is, the violence is not only there to do violence on the victims of the violence, but the violence also serves the role of pleasing the bystanders or the greater audience, the public. So I would say that fascism even comes with a public disposition to enjoy violence against minorities, against people with other political opinions, against intellectuals. Yeah, fascism has always been an anti-intellectualist movement. Yeah, a movement that wants to undo with sciences, enlightenment, and so on. Like defamation against scientists has always been part of fascism. And the thing is, yeah, that fascism is this state of a society where you would perform the violence as a spectacle, for others to join in terms of pleasure, laughter, maybe co-violence, and so on. And this we can very well observe, actually. For instance, in the US, only think of the deportations. You can also observe it in Germany, or the beginnings of that in Germany. For instance, again, when it comes to deportations of migrants, which is a completely, like in factual terms, a completely useless policy, but in emotional terms, they do it to please the electorate, which is then also a form of violence you do for the pleasure of others. And as a next point, fascism is always a popular movement. Yeah, fascism is not easy to grasp in Marxist terms, where you would speak of the rule of some bourgeois capitalists against the workers. Fascism has always been a worker movement, or a movement including or involving the workers. It is a movement that also, or politics that also goes against the interests of the workers. This is the paradox, and that has kind of triggered many theoreticians in the 20th century rethink Marxism, or kind of ask the question of why do people actually engage in a politics and even vote for politics that is obviously against their own interests. This is something I mentioned to you already in the third lecture when we went through the different terms of power, yeah, and that was the moment we came up with these subjectification notions of power, because you kind of have to offer a social theory that can deal with this paradox, that people move or endorse and even become an active part in politics or in a form of society that goes against their own interests. And so fascism has always been a popular movement. It's not an elitist movement. And although only an elite will benefit from the movement, yeah, only capitalist elites will benefit, and that's true for historical fascism as it is for present. And two more very decisive points. The next one is the violence that is so characteristic of fascist politics does not only hit political opponents or others. Let me finish the sentence first, okay. But the violence also serves this very, from the point of view of fascism, important role of destroying democracy, or the Rechtsstaat, the rule of law. Yeah, it's a violence that does not only go against people, but it also wants to smash the rule of law, the state apparatus with its division of power and so on. Yes?
Do you think that fascism has that elite benefited baked into its core, as its core structure? Or do you think rather that due to the nature of fascism and the powers that it affords to those in power or those elite, that it is just a match made in heaven, that then the elite can, once it starts happening, the elite go, okay, now I can just gain total power?
Very good question, and a much too big a question for the recap of the last session part of this lecture. And I would say it's even a very interesting question. My spontaneous answer would be that the second option. But to me, the second option is also an inherent connection between fascism and the elite, like the elites benefiting. I would say fascism is not being introduced because some elite identifies this as a way to benefit. Yeah, that would be too instrumental. But I would say that the people who are, by way of their character, equipped with the dispositions to actually embody fascist politics, They are such rotten in terms of their character that they will be also people who then kind of enter into alliances with elites that will then benefit. Yeah, I think the necessary connection is in the character dispositions of the actors, of the fascist actors, and not in the kind of systemic nature of fascism. Yeah, but that needs obviously a little bit more elaboration. But that is at least my intuition here. Yeah, and we can also see that right this week when Elon Musk and Donald Trump start fighting. Yeah, this is not coincidence. This is how these characters are, and only such characters are sufficiently morally bankrupt that they can even start fascist politics. I would say, I personally believe in the good in human nature, and I think that it needs a very broken character to be able to perform an active role in promoting fascist politics, and that's what you can also just study now when you just watch what's happening between these very powerful people in the States. Yeah, and infightings have always been part of fascist regimes, yeah, even in history, yeah, they have been full of infighting. What is Dolch in English? There was the Night of the Dolche, where in the Hitler regime, overnight, several inside enemies, like more moderate people in the NSDAP, were murdered, just as an example for power fights, infighting, and so on. Yeah, and it's also part of fascism. Maybe I should stay with that point here for a second because it fits well. It's also part of fascism. They do not resolve their conflicts by discourse, yeah? Not Donald Trump and Elon Musk. They do not sit down and debate and then they have a solution, which might be a compromise between their both interests, and then they go for it. It's a form of politics that is based on violence, and the violence that they try to use, yeah, like when Elon Musk tries to think, what can I now tweet that will really insult Donald Trump? And then, let's go for the pedophile track and so on. Yeah, that is how they how they try to resolve conflicts. That is how they work. It's not only the like the public facing surface of it. This is the style. And in the anti-democratic element of fascism means that fascists do not want deliberation or political debate as a means of resolving conflict. This is why fascist parties, also in Germany, and fascist actors would consider political opponents not as opponents but as enemies. Yeah, there is this fundamental distinction of somebody who is of a different opinion to you. They can either be an opponent, yeah, so you respect them as a human being, as a citizen, but they have another opinion. Then they are your opponent, and with your opponent you would meet at eye level, and then you debate, or you use democratic mechanisms such as voting to resolve the conflict between the two opinions. But if you consider your opponent not an opponent but an enemy, you dehumanize that person. Yeah, you only want to destroy that person, and that suddenly opens a new realm of weapons that you can use against that person. Yeah, then you go for doxing or defamation campaigns or personal threats or threats to their family members. Yeah, that's what you then do, and this is exactly the discourse strategy also, for instance, of the AfD in Germany, and this is a marker of fascist politics because it does not treat the political opponents as humans but as people who have to be destroyed. Yeah, and the fourth, and I would say also vital characteristic of fascism, and this is maybe the piece I try to add to this debate with my research, is that fascism has always been characterized also by making use of emerging or new technologies as power instruments, as Machtinstrument, as instruments of power. In the Nazi Germany, you could see that very well, although this is not something that I learned at school. The Nazis entered into a very intimate collaboration with IBM, yeah, the computer company IBM from New York. They had this punch card technology that was comparatively new at that time, like in the 20s, in the 1920s. And Hitler wanted to have a census for Prussia, like 4 months after his taking the power, a census that he wanted to be 10 times faster than usual censuses operated at that time. Yeah, the Prussian Statistics Office said it will take 4 years, and he said, no, it has to be done until summer, and that was like 4 or 5 months, I don't know. And so ABM came along and offered doing the census as a contract, and they even had to invent a larger, using punch cards, using punch card machines, which were the mass data computational technology available at that time. And they even had to produce a bigger punch card format to fit all the demographic data Hitler wanted. And he certainly already had his kind of apparatus of annihilation in mind when he, because he wanted to use the demographic data also to discriminate against people and murder people. And that was the starting point for a prolonged collaboration between IBM and the Hitler fascist regime, where IBM would even proactively provide technology that would amplify or fit the political goals of the Nazis, so that you can argue, and I've not invented this, it goes back to Black, who is the author of that, Edwin Black, of that study in the early 2000s, of that connection between IBM and the Nazis, so that at least you can argue that the extent of the murderous apparatus of the Nazis is hard to imagine without the computational technology that was at some point after a couple of years available in every concentration camp, in every state administrative office, at every train station. They had punch card machines in every school and so on. Like a weird relation between the regime and technology is characteristic of fascism. Yeah, on the one hand, they admire technology for its powerful possibilities, and on the other hand, fascist regimes are vastly anti-intellectual and certainly do not create the environment it needs for new technologies to be researched and built, as you can also observe right now in the US, where many scientists are now thinking to leave. Yeah, and I think, and this is the last slide on this, AI, it's really important to bear in mind that AI does not necessarily, please don't get me wrong, and don't be too pessimistic, but still it's important to be aware that AI can serve fascist interests, and I would say in at least 3 ways that are evident right now. The one way is very obvious, and we have talked about that many times in the lecture. AI is, like predictive analytics, is perfect for sorting individuals based on, for instance, their sexual orientations, their political interests, their mental health, their physical health, and which are all categories that have been used in the fascist regimes of the past to murder people. And that can be done predictively by AI. I'm not saying that it is being done, although if you look in the US right now and the deportations, maybe, but that needs to be researched. But at least it's a technology that might be of interest to fascists. Yeah?
A little tidbit from the United States. So with Doge and the breaking open of government agencies, one of the pieces of information that specifically Donald Trump is trying to extract from these government agencies is private user information, so private citizen information, and it seems like Donald Trump is trying to create a massive database of all of our information.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure how much Donald Trump, I don't want to get Donald Trump out of it, but the thing is that it's not only Donald Trump, but even also, for instance, Elon Musk, who is a private person, also accessing this data. And what Doge has been doing is like traveling around the different state administrative facilities with their hard drives and sniffing all the data. And now they have massive linking programs, data linking programs. They try to link the decentralized, the data that was stored in a decentralized fashion. They try to link it, so that you can link the data the veteran service or ministry has from you with the data from the social security services, with the data from any other state office. And it has a purpose that states do not normally store all the data from all administrative services in one database, yeah, but store it in a decentralized fashion. This is to make attacks more difficult, yeah, attacks on your privacy, attacks on that want to get comprehensive lists of demographic information or of information that can be used to harm the certain citizens. So a second interest of AI for fascism is very evident right now in generative AI, with image generative AI and text generative AI obviously being well suited to serve propaganda interests. I would even call it propaganda 2.0 because, for instance, when Grok, Elon Musk's large language model, yeah, by XAI, when Grok was found 2 or 3 weeks ago to, without even being asked, reproduce the false conspiracy narrative of an alleged white genocide in South Africa, for instance, yeah, the large language model or the chatbot would include information on that alleged genocide in prompts without being asked for it. That is a perfect example of how large language models can be used as propaganda machines. And if it's more subtle, yeah, if it's not an obviously false claim, but something more just skewed in terms of values, for instance, sexisms and racisms, which Grok also reproduces, you can see how propaganda will sneak in, for instance, chatbot interactions in a way that is hard to detect because the machines will not identically repeat propaganda headlines, but they will just sew in information or skewed information into normal replies. And the same goes for image generative AI, Donald Trump, but also Javier Milei in Argentina, who is also a proto-fascist head of state. Even the AfD in Germany, they all make heavy use of AI-generated images for PR purposes, yeah, for instance, campaigning. And they don't even deny, and they don't have to deny that it's AI-generated images. That's also very interesting. If I have a reference for you if you're interested in this. But let's go for the third point first. And as we saw in the last week, some of the ideological roots of fascism are evident also in tech ideologies. And that makes for the third big connection between AI and fascism. And these are 3 points of affinity. I'm not claiming that all AI is fascistic. Yeah, that's bullshit. But there is a huge tendency. I would say it's more. The tendency is more in AI technology. Yeah, by saying AI technology, I specifically mean AI in its economic form. Yeah, in its form done by startups or huge companies such as OpenAI or Elon Musk's companies or Google or Apple, and AI technology shares some heavy or has heavy overlaps in terms of its ideological roots with things that also lead to fascism. If you want to read more on this, I can recommend these 2 books here. This one here in the last, you should look in the back, yeah, for instance, in the last chapter, it's very interesting. If you want to learn more about this connection between generative AI and fascism in terms of image generative AI, I really very much recommend this talk to you. It's in German, unfortunately. All these presentations here are in German, I'm sorry for that. This is an excellent talk on the concept of fascism. Natascha Strobel does an excellent job here summarizing the concept of fascism. And also here recently in The Guardian by Robert Reich, a US-American professor who has been very vocal in warning about the radicalism of the Trump regime. I can highly recommend. Okay, problem is, now it's already half an hour gone for only the recap, and we have 4 exciting and very important parts of this lecture. First of all, I want to say a little bit more about the rationality ideology, because I was told that you were debating this in the discussion groups, and I think it was not completely getting clear last time what makes for this rationality. The important thing is this rationality ideology in the sense of the rationalist movement does not only mean being logical or always thinking in logical symbolic calculus and deductions or syllogisms or whatever it is, but it is a mindset, and a mindset of self-optimization. Yeah? So this rationalist movement is a movement that says, in evolution, our brains are optimized not for truth, but for survival, and that, for instance, has the implication that cognitively we use, for instance, heuristics or biases or cognitive shortcuts, and they are not always rational. And so how can we be more rational? Like, how can I be more rational? It's really this kind of self-optimization program. As much as these people go to the gyms, they would go to the Less Wrong forums and train their epistemic character in terms of getting more rational. And this rationality has two, I would say, roughly maybe two aspects. The one is epistemic rationality, and here Bayesian reasoning plays a very central role, and I will explain that to you on the next slide in more detail. But also overcoming these cognitive biases. Yeah, probably you know better as cognitive science students than I do. The list of cognitive biases is long. No, it's long, including such things as confirmation bias or anchoring biases or base rate neglect and all the things that you know. And they kind of are interested in this, also in terms of psychology. Yeah, it's also a movement that is heavily involved in psychology or cognitive psychology, or how you would call that. And the other aspect is the instrumental use of this form of rationality. The idea that we can kind of make practical use of these principles. It's not only a theoretical interest, but we really kind of want to change the way they behave in the world. And that is, for instance, also when it turns ethical, when these rationalistic principles turn into normative principles or ethical principles, for instance, when it comes to long-term planning or goal alignment let's say you face a decision. Shall I buy this fridge or that fridge? And then, how can you make the decision? Most people just go for an intuitive decision. The one looks nicer. But and if it's now a more complicated decision or more important decision than which fridge you buy, you might see that overcoming your biases or doing statistical calculations might play a role. And this is what rationalists want to do. And I find it very important that this principle that it is about getting a better outcome in the real world. They start from this idea our brains evolved for survival, not for truth. And to one extent, this means, okay, we should kind of reflect and overcome these heuristics and shortcuts. But on the other hand, it also means that truth-seeking alone is not a goal in itself. But what they strive for is more efficiency, getting things done effectively, and not so much seeing the truth in something. And this is a very important difference that will also, that in my view is of heavy impact ideologically. To make this point a little bit clear about the Bayesian mindset, and this is also very important in AI ethics, I would say. I'm not sure how much, did you encounter somewhere in the Coxie program Bayesian statistics? Yeah. So yes, you did. So Bayesian theorem and all this is something that you know. That's good. Then we can save some time in the lecture. That's perfect. For the people online and out there on YouTube, I will just skip over it and you can play it slowly and then you can also have it. But I'm not sure how much this was introduced to you in the lectures, if it was, for instance, a statistics or a mathematics lecture. Bayesian statistics also comes with a certain interpretation of probability itself. And in the philosophy of statistics, you would call that a subjective interpretation of the term probability. Who knows what a subjective interpretation of probability is? So this was not discussed in the Bayesian statistics lecture, only Bayes theorem, yeah? Only calculating probabilities? Okay, not knowing what the probability is. Good. So, like, what is a probability, yeah? It's not such an easy question, isn't it? And I think what is more dominant nowadays in common sense is the newer, the more recent definition or understanding of probability. And this is not even on my slides now, so I'm just kind of introducing it now to give some context here, which is the frequentist notion of probability. A notion of probability that kind of goes by the frequency, the relative frequency of an event to occur in an infinite chain of repetitions of the same setting or experiment. Yeah, for instance, what is the probability that I throw heads with my coin? If I say it is 50%, then in a frequentist interpretation or understanding of probability, that means if you repeat the coin toss in an independent way in an infinite number of times, then 50% or the number of heads versus tails will converge to 50% of the overall number of repetitions. Yeah, so this is a frequentist interpretation of probability. It assumes that you can repeat the same setting or experiment many times without mutual influence. Yeah, I mean, I can repeat the coin toss. Yeah, I can assume that if I toss it a second time, the second toss is not influenced by the first toss because the causal chain might be interrupted. So it makes sense. I can repeat that. I can make this notion of probability is heavily used in physics. Yeah, where you usually isolate some small fraction of the world. For instance, one atom shooting on the other atom, and then what happens? The result will always be statistical statements because that's quantum mechanics. That's a statistical form of physics, or a form of physics that articulates its law as statistical laws. And then you always assume, okay, when I hear some probability statement, there is the implicit assumption that I can meaningfully repeat the same setting infinitely many times and see the outcome, and then I can count. And the relative number of the desired outcome compared to the total number of repetitions is then that probability. That doesn't make sense, however, in certain other constellations. For instance, what is the probability that I die tomorrow? Does that make sense to implicitly assume a repetition of that experiment? Does it even assume that this is an experiment? Or what is the probability that it rains when I get outside in 1.5 hours? Yeah, there will not be there will no repeating the 10th of June at 4 p.m. There is no meaningful conception of repeating this identically. Or, for instance, what is the probability that my stock in which I'm invested will fall next hour, so that I should sell now? Also, there is no meaningful interpretation in terms of repetition. Yeah, I cannot repeat this. I can only sell, or I cannot sell my stock. And this is what when we use probabilities for decision making, decisions about a single case that is a case that I cannot repeat or bring back or and so on, then we need a different interpretation of probability, and that is the interpretation that is underlying Bayesian statistics. And that is understanding of probability that is tied to the single act or the single instance, and not it does not kind of fantasize about infinite many repetitions. And then it is a statement that you can best explain in economic terms. How much would you bet on me dying tomorrow, or on it raining at 4 p.m., or on the stock falling? Yeah, so how confident am I that the stock will fall, or how confident am I that it will rain at 4 p.m.? For instance, it takes some effort carrying or bringing in an umbrella. So on the one hand, I have costs in bringing an umbrella, but if it rains, the umbrella is very useful and will save me some hassles. So there is a cost-benefit analysis where my confidence in how likely it is that it will rain plays a role. Yeah? When I'm very confident, then I would definitely bring the umbrella. When I'm very confident it will not rain, I will definitely not bring it because I don't like the extra luggage. If I'm only something in between, then the question is, how confident am I? And then I can determine whether I bring the umbrella. And such an economic interpretation of probability, how much would I bet? How much, what risk in terms of, for instance, money would I take? That is a subjective interpretation of probability. Why is it subjective? That's not yet completely clear, because it's an understanding of probability that is always tied to me as somebody who has a certain amount of information about the situation. Let's go for the example with the umbrella, because that's I think best suited to make that clear. It's about me and not only about the rain. Yeah, the question, does it rain at 4 p.m. outside of the building, is, you can ask it as an objective question, but that's often not the case. The question is more, why is it even a matter? Because I want to know whether I should bring an umbrella. So I am into this question as well. It's not only, I'm not seeking knowledge only about the world, but I'm seeking knowledge about me in relationship to the world, pertaining to the question of whether I should bring an umbrella. And imagine I get an update. For instance, somebody in 10 minutes to 4, somebody will call me and tell me it's raining. So I know rather for sure that it will also be raining at 4. Then I have new information, and then I will update this probability. And this is what Bayesian statistics is all about. Yeah? That a subject, a person, an entity wants to make a judgment, a decision, based on incomplete information. And that information might update. Yeah? You might get new information. And if the information gets an update, then you also want to update your probabilities. And this is exactly what the Bayesian theorem does. It's this incremental belief updating in light of new evidence using Bayes' theorem. Yeah, here on the slides I reflected this in slightly different terms. Yeah? For instance, I wanted you to know that when you use a classifier in machine learning to make a decision, let's say to classify a person, the output of a neural net will always be probability weights. And what you often see in when you use machine learning classifiers to make a decision is, what shall we decide when this is the output of such a neural net? Usually you decide on the highest probability weight. Yeah, for instance, and you will see how this is related to the state in a couple of minutes. Let's imagine, for some reasons, you want to classify people in terms of, for instance, sexual identity, to decide what kind of advertisement to play out to them. And this is the output of your classifier. So actually you cannot classify that person because the highest probability weight here is not so high. But at least the highest probability weight kind of stands out compared to other identity categories. So what you often do is you make a decision. Yeah? You do the best bet. You cannot treat them in all ways at the same time. Then you kind of have to make a decision here. And then what you do in this kind of business is that you go by the highest probability, and then you treat the person as if you know that they are queer. And that is the moment when you kind of project down the multitude of possibilities that each have some probability weight to it according to your calculation. You project it down to only one option. Yeah, you would kind of fix the person on the option that seems most likely to you, and that is the moment when you take a bet. Yeah, if I either can play out this advertisement or that advertisement to the person, then you will have to make a decision, and then you take a bet. I take the bet that the person is queer, so because then I will be best off. That would be a typical way of rationalistic reasoning. Yeah, that it's the best bet to treat the person as if I already knew they are queer in this example. Yeah.
Why should the calculation be wrong? Why should it be wrong that if someone is 30% queer and 4% bisexual?
No, in terms of the identity categories, I don't think that this makes any sense at all. But I just want to demonstrate the kind of reasoning that's behind predicting things that people predict on social media to make, for instance, advertisement decisions. And this is already based on the assumption that this is something we should do at all, yeah, which I would doubt. But let's assume that somebody claims to us that they have a classifier that classifies people by these identity categories. And if they then treat people based on these classifications, they will have to make this choice. Yeah, they will have to choose among a range of options, and they often would sell it publicly as like a mechanism that can for sure categorize people. Imagine it's not sexual identity, but whether you fraud the social security system, yes or no. Yeah, and this is being done, yeah, using AI systems in detecting, for instance, tax fraud or social welfare fraud. This is something that's being done. People would sell such systems to you, saying, yeah, they can decide. But internally, these systems will deal with probabilities and then take the bet. Yeah, it's the most rational bet to treat the person as if they frauded the system or as if they are queer in this example. Yeah, you can call it the prediction gap. Applying predictive models to individual cases means converting population-based statistical inferences to point predictions about a single instance. That's what I mean, and this is the epistemic interest shifts from the population, where you always have variety, to the single case. And this is also the difference between frequentist statistics, which looks at large numbers, and if it then says that 30% of people are queer, then that means, yeah, that's a statement about a total population or a large number or infinite repetitions, while automated decision making is always about the single case. And this is a completely different statistical situation. Then you are not interested in the population, you are interested in the single case, and then you have to act on probabilities. Yeah, you only know that the person is frauding the system, yeah, by 47%, but all the other options are less than 47, so you take the bet, for instance. And it is an interest not in truth, but about the individual, but in the most effective treatment. And this relates back to what I told you kind of a couple of minutes ago, that in this rationalistic movement, it is less about finding the truth about somebody, but about how can I treat you most efficiently. I estimate the highest probability that you are frauding me, so I treat you as if, and then in the long run, I will benefit from that way of treatment. And I don't care about the truth about you, but I only care for efficient treatment. Efficient, of course, in scare quotes, because that is actually very cynical. And this is what the rationalist movement does. And this principle of belief updating is then the inherent aspect about the Bayesian theorem, where you have and this is also something that these rationalists care for a lot, that they always kind of want to update their confidence in certain things in light of new evidence. And this is what the Bayesian theorem that you learned in the statistics classes does. Yeah, you have some prior level of confidence in a hypothesis or a prior probability of something that it rains at 4. My prior probability is that it rains by 50% because it rains on every second day in Osnabrück. And now I have additional information, for instance, that it already rained when I got in here. So I have to correct, in light of the new evidence, I have to correct my prior and obtain a new probability value under the condition that it already rained when I entered this building. And this is what the Bayesian theorem does. Yeah, this probability updating in light of new evidence. Maybe this is surprising, and let's do it at least quickly. Yeah, this is the Bayesian theorem. You know that already, and let's directly go into this example of disease testing. Let's say the hypothesis is that Kenny has a certain rare disease. Let's say the disease is prevalent in 1 out of 1,000 cases. So it's the prior probability that anybody here has the disease is 1 in 1,000. Yeah, that is the completely the probability without any further empirical evidence. And then comes a new piece of evidence. For instance, that Kenny just tested positive for this disease. And then you can observe in psychology that many people overreact and they say, oh, this is a death verdict or whatever it might be. I have the disease. And then comes the rationalists and say, oh, if you really study Bayesian statistics, then you know better. And I tell you now how. And the thing is that it really depends on the test features. Yeah, for instance, every test has a false positive rate and a false negative rate. So false positive rate, that it shows a positive test result, but the person does not have the disease. That happens with a certain probability or with a certain likelihood. And also a false negative rate, yeah, that it shows a negative result, but you have the disease. And let's say this is both 1%. Yeah, here, in 1% of the cases, you have the false positive and or false negative. And then you can do this calculation using Bayes' theorem that basically only gives you this probability updating. So how likely is it that Kenny has the disease in light of the positive test result? And you can calculate it based on the prior probability, which is the 1 in 1,000 probability. And the updating of that probability goes by this factor here. And how can we calculate this factor? And it's a lot of maths. We don't have to go through that here now. But the thing is, in the end, it's only 9% likely that Kenny has the disease, although he had a positive test. Because the test fails, false positives and false negatives are both 1% likely. So for instance, if in 1,000 people, one has the disease and 999 don't have the disease, on these 999 people, let's imagine you test each of them, then on average you will have 10 false positives, 10 of them testing positive. And the one person who has the disease will very likely test positive because by 99% they will test positive. So you have on average 11 positive test results in this among these 1,000 people, and only one really has the disease. Yeah, so you see that the probability is really 1 divided by 11, 9%. This is just to show you some of what rationalists are obsessed with, but also people in machine learning, because Bayesian statistics is the core ingredient of the mathematics of machine learning. There is this movement who has meditated on these calculations or forms of reasoning intensively and tries, because they are so counterintuitive. Yeah, it's heavily counterintuitive to many that the probability that Kenny has the disease is now only 9% and not 100 or 99% or whatever. And this is what they try to see as their goal of self-improvement. Yeah, that they kind of correct the psychological heuristics or shortcuts that people use in making these judgments, intuitive judgments. They want to correct it based on, for instance, Bayes' theorem or Bayesian statistics to be more rational in this sense. And you see that this is a way of calculating with probabilities. Yeah, rationality in the sense of the rationalistic movement has a lot to do with dealing with uncertainty, as this is a community that is with 90% white academically trained men from countries in the global north. You can say it's a dude's way of handling uncertainty. Yeah, although this sounds also progressive and mathematical and overcoming biases is always a good idea and so on, but there is heavy criticism against this as an ideology. I think for me the most salient point is this shift from truth to performance. Yeah, I don't care about getting to know you or like doing justice to you or finding out the truth about you, but I only care of how can I efficiently treat you to be right in most of the cases. And that is a performance criteria. Yeah, I want to perform well on as many cases as possible. And this is an ideology that you can heavily see in AI and in also AI applications in the state. And also, this Bayesian statistics, it's computationally very demanding. Yeah, you can do these computations in your head, try to. So it's not at all intuitive for people to think in line with the Bayesian theorem or something. This is not an accurate descriptive theory of how the mind works or how the psyche works, but it's more a normative theory. And there is this, this has been criticized against the rationalists, that there is this descriptive versus normativity confusion. Yeah, they are actually very normative without noticing. And they over-rely on numeric probabilities. Yeah, maybe not all situations of uncertainty or emotional situations you can easily map to numbers. And then, which number is bigger or which probability is bigger. But this seems to be the way of handling uncertainty here, that you want to handle it as a number and as numbers that you can calculate with and so on. Yeah, and fake rationality, that's also, that has been observed, that people try to they face an uncertainty or difficult decision, and then they don't want to be irrational, so they turn everything into numbers and do some calculations, and then they can feel very rational. And but at the same time, they only disguise the situation in something that is formalized, and then you have this fake rationality. That actually is also the way you sell AI systems for decision making. Yeah, we have a public tendency to believe much more in the objectivity of numbers. When you say that something that is actually a matter of discretion, for instance, should I penalize the unemployed person for provoking his own unemployment? You get a penalty in Germany for that. That's actually a matter of discretion by the caseworker in the unemployment office. When you sell to people that this can now be done by AI because it's objective and based on numbers, then people say, it needs to be objective. This is this tendency to believe in the objectivity of numbers. And this is also very important. Garbage in, garbage out. Yeah, maybe the weakest spot in the Bayesian theorem is the prior. Yeah, the belief updating is only a chain. Yeah, you have a prior belief. How prior is it? That you frauded the social security system, it's maybe 1 in a million, and then by certain additional evidence you update that, so you multiply the prior probability by some correction factor according to the Bayes theorem, and then you have the updated probability. And everybody takes care of getting the Bayes theorem and the correction factors right, but not equally people take care of getting the prior right. If the prior is wrong, so if you base your whole analysis on garbage data, which produces very, for instance, skewed statistical evidence or underrepresents certain groups, then you have garbage in, and then you will also get only garbage out. That is actually maybe the biggest flaw in this whole form of reasoning. What happens when you use this in public administration? In public administration, classically, it works like this. You get a case, like for instance, you apply for unemployment money. Then there is a case officer in the administration looking at your case. They will make a decision, yeah? You get the unemployment money, you don't get it, or maybe you get it under certain conditions. Or maybe you get it, but only with a penalty of a 2-week delay. And the case officer classically has 2 tasks. And now we are shifting from the statistics more to the legal aspects. The one task is, does the case actually meet the legal requirements? Yeah, there are certain requirements encoded in the law that makes you entitled to receive, for instance, unemployment money or welfare. And that is basically a checklist. Yeah, you have to subsume the case under the law, the codified law, and does it meet the criteria? For instance, in unemployment, did you pay unemployment insurance before? Or did you not quit the job yourself, but you were fired? Yeah, if you quit yourself, you will at least not immediately get unemployment money. After the caseworker decides that the criteria are met, then there can be administrative decisions that involve a second task, and that task is discretion. Because in some cases or in some legal domains, the legal consequence is not always the same, but it can be smaller or bigger or amplified or not. For instance, when you apply for unemployment money and it turns out that you provoked your firing, for instance, you misbehaved on your job so that you provoked being fired, that usually would lead to a penalty. And determining this penalty, between 0 and let's say 4 weeks, that is a matter of discretion. That is where the caseworker will have to kind of weigh the case in relation to other cases, and also based on experience and on how severe the violation of the rules was, and then that is called discretion. And there is always this proportionality principle, that the legal consequences, for instance, the penalty has to be in proportion with the severity of the wrongdoing or the thing that triggers the legal consequence. This Verhältnismäßigkeitsgrundsatz, principle of proportionality, that will have to be observed by the caseworker. And this is also what happens often in courts. When you, for instance, what can you do if you get this decision and you do not agree with the decision? You usually will go for a Widerspruch. You refuse to accept that administrative decision, and you have a legal means to object to the decision and to go for redress. Then you would say, no, but I don't accept the decision, and then maybe it goes back to the office and they stay, let's say then they stay with their decision. Then ultimately you can bring it in front of a court. This is part of the rule of law or of Rechtsstaat, that administrative decisions are always open for legal scrutiny and potentially legal redress if the decision was wrong. The case goes in front of some court, and the court will review the case. So they will have to know, okay, what did the caseworker do? They noticed that it fulfills all the requirements, and then they did some discretion, and what are the arguments for the discretion, and then there was a decision. The court will review that, and for instance, they can decide, but it was not proportional. For instance, in the legal consequences, they determined that you get 4 weeks of a penalty, 4 weeks without unemployment money. That is not proportional to what you did to trigger that consequences. Then the court can tell the office that's not proportional. Or, for instance, the court can also say that that does not obey the Gleichbehandlungsgrundsatz. It's discriminating. It violates the principle of equal treatment. If the court finds that you were treated based, for instance, on gender or racial ethnicity belonging, you were treated to your disadvantage, then the court can say, this does not meet the principle of equal treatment. And then with that decision, the court will not say, therefore you only get 2 weeks of a penalty or 1 week. This is something the court cannot do, but the court can say this was not proportional, or this was not adhering to the equal treatment principle. And then the case goes back to the administrative office, up here. The case goes back to the caseworker or to that entity, and they will have to revise the decision. Why does the court not determine the corrected legal consequences? Why does the court not say it's only 2 weeks instead of 4 years?
You don't have your authority.
Why not?
Because we have like a separation of powers.
This is the separation of powers. Only the executive can make the decision, and the judicative can say the decision was wrong on certain terms, but the decision needs to be done by the executive. And this is how they play ping pong, or why the case goes in circles. And for a good reason. This is a feature and not a bug, that this goes in circles. That might take some time and involves different peoples and party. This is the classical separation of powers in a rule of law state. Let's imagine we automate that with AI. We use AI instead of the caseworker. Here it is. So the AI system makes a decision. The decision might also be open for legal remedy. No human will see that here. It's only like a classifier that can also classify, for instance, these penalties. So the AI system will do both it checks that the requirements are met and the discretion part. Let's imagine, yeah, we just automate the caseworker. Then we could say, yeah, it's much more efficient because it just throws out the decisions, and then most people will just accept the decision. So we saved a lot of money because we don't have to hire the caseworkers. Yeah, because that scales much better. We only need one AI system, and it can deal with millions of cases, while millions of cases need millions of caseworkers for 3 hours each. So it scales much better. Haha, we save a lot of money. And then I'm still playing the devil's advocate. We can even say, yeah, and if you are treated wrong, I mean, after all, we are in a Rechtsstaat. If you are treated wrong, you just go for legal remedy. So you bring your case, you object with your case, and then maybe the objection will be observed by the administrative office immediately, or it goes through a court, and then it will be handled by a person, and the person will say, yeah, okay, the model decided wrong, and then they will correct the decision, and they will train the model accordingly, so that the model gets updated, and maybe next time a similar case occurs, it might not do this wrong decision. I'm still playing a devil's advocate here, the devil's advocate advocating for the use of AI to reduce bureaucracy in scare quotes. I think this is kind of how you could envision it in the scare quote best way. Why best way? I mean, the worst way would be if you do not do the things down here, yeah, but only that here, so that the AI system will decide your fate and you will not have any means of remedy. But they might argue, as long as there are these means of remedy, no harm done. Yeah, you can, and I'm still not agreeing with this, but I'm trying to sketch a certain antagonistic position here. They might say, yeah, no harm done, because you can always go for legal redress, and for the system it's much more efficient because we will only have to use human hours for handling these cases here, and we will not spend any money and human hours on handling kind of the normal, trivial, simple cases. There are certain objections to this view, and it's very important, as we are in the decade where everybody calls for the use of AI to allegedly reduce bureaucracy. There are inherent flaws in this argument, and I want to go through them here one by one. The first flaw is that such a model is typically less accurate on underrepresented demographics. So the likelihood that your case is being treated accurately increases when you are in a more average or more hegemonic demographic, and the more special your case is, be it that you are demographically marginalized, or be it that you have a very special case, like a complicated case with different factors overlapping, will make it less likely that the model has a lot of training data on your case, and so the decision will be more volatile or more inaccurate on your case. This is the first thing, that it has already a discriminatory performance, or the performance is less accurate for people who are already marginalized. The second argument is here, and this goes back to the prediction gap slide that I showed you earlier, where I told you that I will get back to it. Such a decision here will always be a decision that is done in a similar way to what I told you with the prediction gap. Yeah, there will only be probabilities between these outcomes here, and the model will have to decide what is most likely or whatever. And this is then not a reasoned decision. It's just an optimization procedure. The thing is, optimization is not something that is compatible with the rule of law principle, where you have the right to be treated in a way that can be legally justified. Yeah? The state has the obligation to treat you in a way that is legally justified. Going for something that is most likely to be right is not a good reason to treat you in a certain way. So the classification procedure here might fail the obligation to reason for the decision. And this will at least be relevant once you bring the case in front of court. Yeah, for instance, when you go for legal remedy, somebody must review the decision, and then then it will be intransparent how the decision was reached, because the decision was reached based on Bayesian statistical reasoning, which is not a reason, and then the court will not be able to deal with that. So you do not have the transparency that is necessary to enable legal remedy or legal redress to the people affected from the decisions. And then the third objection is that, and this is again a real-world observation, precarious and marginalized and vulnerable people are statistically much less likely to go for legal redress. If you are a person who is not familiar with the language, with the system, with the country, which is already marginalized, which suffers, for instance. But we can also go for different examples. Imagine you just got a diagnosis for a lethal disease. Maybe you have different things on your mind than fighting in front of a court against the decision of your health insurance to not cover your cancer treatment. So when you are in a vulnerable situation, you are less likely to go for legal redress, and the legal redress will take time. If it's about a cancer treatment, you might already be dead when the legal remedy happened. Or if it is about deportation decisions, the same holds. Yeah? We have many examples where the state, also the German state, tries to be quicker than any legal remedy to just produce facts instead of waiting for the Rechtsstaat to make its decision. So for these three reasons, I find it hard for the principle of the rule of law to be observed or maintained when you use AI decision-making, probabilistic decision-making, to automate bureaucratic functions in the state. The second point here is what I described previously, and I have it on this slide once again. The output of the classifier will be something that goes by probability weights. In this case, one decision has to be made, and they will decide for the highest probability in the sense of taking a bet. Yeah, this is the moment where we take the bet that this case should better be declined, because then in most cases in front of court, we will win. And this is the moment when the probability, which is actually a probability about large cohorts, 60% of the people with a similar data signature, their cases should be denied. This is the actual statement, but that statement gets converted into a single person prediction, 60% likelihood of that single person. And then we don't have this frequentist, but a subjective interpretation of probability, where the administrative office says, for us, it is most efficient to deny that decision here, because in most cases, we will be better off. But this is not rule of law. This is not seeking for the truth and treating people based on the truth, but this is optimization logics. This is what you would do in economics or in a startup, but not in the state. Yeah, so there are ethical risks of predictive decision-making in administration, and these risks are that decisions are more inaccurate for groups underrepresented in the training data. Vulnerable groups are less likely to complain or go for legal remedy, and then the underrepresented people will still stay underrepresented, because then if they don't go for legal remedy, they will not produce training data that retrains the system. Yeah? So this is actually a vortex that leads to even more negative performance. Are you raising your hand? So the third point is that crossing the prediction gap is a form of reasoning that does not allow reasoning and scrutiny. I mean transparency and scrutiny. So I would say in adopting AI in administration, you can distinguish between three stages. Yeah, is AI only a tool, which would mean, for instance, you speed up things that otherwise humans would do, but without any disadvantages in terms of transparency or reasoning and so on. For instance, digitalizing forms or maybe even templates, emails. Yeah, why the decision. The letters communicating decisions, they can also be written by large language models as long as they are being reviewed by human workers. And that is, I would say, AI as a tool. AI as an aid would be semi-automated decisions. Yeah, for instance, AI systems review the cases and they suggest some decisions to the caseworkers, but not do the decisions. I'm rather skeptical about that because it is a well-documented form of bias, the so-called automation bias. Yeah, that people tend to believe more in the output of computing systems than they would believe in the conclusions or opinions of other people, themselves included. So you observe systematically and for more than 20 years that if you introduce assistant systems, computer-assisted decision-making, people tend to just believe the computer without doubting the decision. And on top of that, there is the phenomenon that once you have these assistant systems, you would expect from the caseworkers to do more decisions in the same time because they now have these assistances. So they don't have any time to really think through the cases and doubt the decisions. Also, it has been observed that in some cases, or maybe even in the majority of cases, it takes a lot of courage to distrust the computer decision, and then you have to argue that in front of your boss or in front of your collaborators and make things complicated so that the workday takes longer than it can take if we just so there is a lot of social pressure to observe these AI decisions in semi-automated settings. And then the third stage would be AI as a replacement, where you go for automated decision-making in the way I just showed you on the previous slide, where the first human contact would be when you object as the customer or as the citizen. And I would say that the responsible use of AI in my view, is currently limited to that stage here. And I think it takes a lot of, I mean, there is some promising research on how this can be done well here. But I think this is something that still needs to be sorted out, whether there are reliable mechanisms, for instance, to bypass the automation bias. And it depends a lot on economic factors, yeah, that you would leave people enough time and no social pressure to obey the computer decisions and so on. To me, a touchstone in such projects would be, does the use of AI in administration only automate the existing decision-making logic, yeah, for instance, speed it up, or does it implement a new decision-making logic? And replacing a reasoned decision by a Bayesian probability maximizing decision is certainly a new logic of decision-making, and that should be kept in mind. And actually, when we look at Doge, there is this nice article. You can forget all of what I said because what they do is so much more primitive and stupid. It really deserves that term, stupid. They use AI systems that do not even qualify as classifiers or any form of sufficiently maintained decision-making systems. They would just use large language models and encapsulate probabilistic decision-making in LLM prompts. And there is a very nice documentation on this just published by ProPublica, which is also the kind of homework reading, discussion group reading for this week. So I will not spare so many words here on this issue because it's really so stupid that it's not even worth wasting lecture time on that. But instead, I would like to go to this, to jump to this last part, because on the event in the theater last week, it was brought up by some of the students that all this here is a rather pessimistic outlook, especially the whole AI tech ideology thing delivers or conveys a rather pessimistic outlook on AI, as you are maybe yourself studying into AI or into the use of AI. And I therefore maybe want to spend the next 3 slides on kind of telling you what I think I want to communicate to you here. And I think there are indeed 3 things that you can do, or things that you can do on 3 layers at least. And the thing is, you will have to do them. I cannot do them for you. And this is maybe the main message. It is on you. And the pessimistic outlook is also something that I would say you should be able to bear, to be exposed to be maybe even a little bit shaken, because it's kind of meant to be a wake-up call to do things better. And It is in your hand, and you must do it. And I cannot solve these problems for you, the meaning problem for you. I would say the one thing you can do is explain to everybody, including your colleagues, the value of democracy and the rule of law, the value of and the urgency of good regulation of technology, the value of publicly funded research, like it is done at the IKW. Yeah, when I was talking here about AI ideologies, we are here on an island. I'm state funded from your tax money, and so is the whole IKW. And all the things you study there, research there, and get involved. Yeah, this is state-funded fundamental research. This is not aiming for startups. There is comparatively little startup or tech ideology in our house. But this, unfortunately, is rare, or this is at least marginally internationally. For instance, in California, there is almost no state-funded research at all. All the research is usually privately funded and therefore has to pay out to the investors at some point. This is not normally the case here in Germany. The usual discourse around that is, oh, we are so innovation hostile. But the thing is, no, we do the fundamental research that is then being used elsewhere to gain profits. And that there is the state, or like this status here, where you can do research without asking for the profits, is actually something that we should preserve, and that we should even have more. In terms of your relationship to the political situation, and this maybe goes also to the international listeners of this lecture, you are part of the state and of society. You are not only a researcher. And that means get active, speak up, organize democratically against emerging fascism and emerging authoritarian politics. Don't behave like a mere consumer of the state, and not even of state-funded fundamental research here. Yeah, you cannot only consume it, but give something back or be part of the system in the sense of upholding it. Don't leave when you still can get involved politically. And I'm saying that especially also to people in the US. I mean, now we see the protests in LA, but for a long time I've been kind of waiting for big protests to emerge. And instead, we can see so many people wanting to leave the US now. For instance, here, this is actually, to me, a huge provocation. Jan LeCun, chief AI scientist at Meta, he put out this LinkedIn post 3 months ago when he says, hey, Europe. This was when US-American researchers started to want to leave the United States for instance, Europe. And he would say, hey, Europe. If you want a vibrant tech industry, right, the US seems set on destroying its public reach, a funding system. Many US-based scientists are looking for a plan B. You may have an opportunity to attract some of the best scientists in the world. Scientists will go where they have the means to be the most creative and productive. Here are the criteria that attract them. First, access to top students and junior collaborators. Second, access to research funding with little administrative overhead. Third, good compensation. Fourth, freedom to do research on what they think is most promising. Fifth, access to research facilities. Sixth, ability to collaborate. 7, moderate teaching and administrative duties. And now comes the thing. European academia rates high on 1 and 4, low on 2, 5, 6, 7, and very low on 3. 3 is good compensation. What you can see here is the typical tech entitlement. You only get me when you pay me enough, Europe. The thing is, we are not in a market logic as much as they are in the Silicon Valley here. Our research is tax funded, and our research is being done as a part of the common good or commonwealth, a contribution to the commonwealth, and not only a contribution to your personal profit. This is the logic of the tech monarchy, yeah? No voice. I don't care for getting democratically involved. I don't want to speak up. But free exit. Now, as politically things get worse in the States, we want to leave. Yeah, you remember that ideology of the CEO state? No voice, free exit. If you don't like the state, you can go to another state. this is kind of the ideology that shines through these lines here. He wants us, he now wants us to be attractive to these people who are now searching for a new state. I would say no, go on the streets first, and then maybe come once it gets really violent in terms of threatening for your life, but only in terms of, your research freedom is now restricted, and then you go here and accept the lower salaries. That, to me, democratically speaking, does not really sound fair. So this is prototypical for a very consumerist relationship to the state. And if we all ever only consume the state, then we will get the state we deserve. And that is something that you can now observe in the United States. So what can you do in terms of research? Appreciate the value of foundational research in the search for truth instead of only efficiency and profit. Appreciate the public as a source of funding of this research if you benefit the public with that research in return, and avoid easy techno fixes that reduce social and political problems to tech solutions and tech solutionisms. Yeah, that would be my messages, and I think it is your job, to find your individual solutions to that impasse. I think you are at a dramatic juncture point in the historical development right now, because you can see that AI technology is not the happy-go-lucky thing anymore that it might have been the last 20 years, but still it is a very powerful and potentially useful technology if you turn it into one. This whole thing, what I just say, also reflects in the program of the lecture. I said I have 3 blocks, and the first block was getting equipped with some conceptual tools such as power and what is ethics, and the second block was critique and deconstruction of what we take for granted. We took for granted that AI is happy-go-lucky, now it's deconstructed. And it is also a purpose of the second block to produce a certain sense of crisis. That we also endure some doubts and self-questioning, and only after that, I think, it is a good idea to start being normative and take responsibility. And that's what we start next week in the third block of the lecture, where we will be much more positive, less descriptive, and only criticizing, and but more like, what can we do? What does it mean to take responsibility, and so on. Thank you very much, and see you next week.